Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're diving into something really important.
hmm
The way substance use disorders and mental health conditions often, well, overlap and affect each other.
Yeah, they're really intertwined.
Exactly. So we've pulled together some pretty powerful resources. We've got professional insights, some very personal stories about overcoming massive life challenges, and even research looking at the science behind recovery.
Right. The goal is really to unpack all these complexities, these co-occurring issues, and try to understand the different ways people find their way to healing.
Okay, so what sources are we working with today?
Well, first up, we have this really solid guide from Case Western Reserve University. It's aimed at professionals working in substance use, focusing on co-occurring disorders. Very clinical, very thorough,
Good foundation.
definitely. Then we're looking at something quite different, a Reddit thread. Super raw personal stories from people talking about getting through huge challenges, addiction, mental health, money problems, you name it.
Gives that real-world perspective.
Totally. We also have a study, this one's from Keene University, looking at the daily habits and routines of adults who are in early recovery. What do their days actually look like?
Oh, that's interesting. Practical stuff.
Yeah. And finally, there's research from PMC about recovery dharma. It explores how things like mindfulness, meditation, and that peer support aspect contribute to what they call recovery capital.
Recovery capital. Okay. Lots to cover. It sounds like a really rich mix of information.
It is. We're going to try and connect those dots for you.
All right, let's jump in. Co-occurring disorders. It might seem specific, but it's actually pretty common, right?
Surprisingly so. That Case Western Reserve source, it uses SAMHSA data.
Right. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration.
Yeah. And it points out that, while most treatment centers see people with both substance use and mental health issues, get this, only about half actually have specific programs set up to handle both together.
Wow, only half. That seems like a big gap.
It really is. It kind of highlights this critical need for more integrated treatment, doesn't it?
Definitely. Because when someone's dealing with both, it's not just like two separate problems, is it? They interact.
Oh, absolutely. They can amplify each other. The Case Western material makes it clear having both increases the risk for some really serious outcomes. We're talking suicide, trauma, self-harm, even getting tangled up in the criminal justice system.
Right. So it's crucial to address both.
Mm.
Okay, so what makes someone more likely to develop a substance use disorder to begin with? What are the roots?
The Case Western info breaks it down nicely into three buckets: biological, environmental, and substance-related factors.
Okay, let's unpack the biological ones first. What falls under that?
Well, it's a mix. It includes basic brain mechanisms, like how susceptible someone's brain is to addiction. Then there's genetics, of course. Gender can play a role. Any existing mental health conditions.
Like we were just discussing.
Exactly. How someone handles stress, their stress vulnerability,
Yeah.
and even epigenetics.
Like epigenetics, that's how our environment actually changes how our genes work, right?
Spot on. So it's not just the genes you're born with, but how life experiences can switch them on or off, essentially. A really wide range of biological vulnerabilities.
Okay, that's the biology. What about the environmental side?
Just as important, really. Things like growing up in a chaotic home environment,
Yeah, that makes sense.
what the family's attitudes are towards substances, if there's use within the family, peer pressure, obviously, community attitudes matter too, and crucially, experiences like trauma, abuse, neglect. Those are major risk factors.
Heavy stuff. And the third bucket was substance related?
Right. This is about the drug itself and how it's used. So the route of administration, injecting versus swallowing, for example. The specific effects of the drug, how early someone starts using.
Age of first use is a big one, I hear.
Definitely. And simply availability and cost. If it's easy and cheap to get, that increases risk. It's like this really complex web, all these factors interacting.
It really is. Okay, let's get into the science a bit more. How do these substances actually mess with our brains? The neurobiology.
So the Case Western source explains it revolves around neurotransmitters. These are the brain's chemical messengers, letting nerve cells talk to each other. Alcohol and drugs basically interfere with that whole signaling process.
How do they interfere?
Well, a couple of ways. Some drugs, like cannabis or heroin, actually have a chemical structure that's super similar to our natural neurotransmitters, so they can just latch onto the receptors and activate them, basically tricking the brain.
Ah, like a counterfeit key fitting the lock.
Kind of, yeah. Then you have others, like amphetamine or cocaine. They work differently. They cause this massive abnormal flood of natural brain chemicals. Dopamine is the big one here in the reward system.
Dopamine, yeah, the pleasure chemical.
Right. Or these drugs might block the normal reuptake process. Usually the brain recycles neurotransmitters, but these drugs stop that, leaving way too much dopamine floating around in those reward pathways.
So that huge dopamine flood
Hmm.
that creates the intense pleasure high, right?
Exactly. But here's the problem with chronic use. The Case Western material talks about brain adaptations. That constant flooding isn't normal.
So the brain tries to adjust.
Precisely. It starts to adapt to this artificial surge. It might reduce its own natural dopamine production, or the dopamine receptors themselves can become less sensitive, kind of like turning down the volume because the music's too loud.
Okay, so what's the consequence of that adaptation?
Well, the natural pleasures in life, hanging out with friends, enjoying food, hobbies, they just don't provide the same kick anymore. Their reward signals become dull.
Ah, so the drug becomes the main way, maybe the only way, to feel good.
Pretty much. Over time, chronic use can leave someone with really limited ways to activate their own reward system naturally. The substance becomes the primary driver of feeling any pleasure or even just feeling normal. It's a core part of the addictive cycle.
Wow. Yeah, and that really helps explain something from that Keene University study on habits.
The one about early recovery routines.
Yeah, it mentioned that people often find unstructured time really difficult. And cravings can be strongly linked to their old patterns of using. It makes sense if their brain is basically wired to expect the substance during those times.
Absolutely. If the brain has adapted to need that substance for dopamine release, suddenly removing it leaves this huge void. The study pointed out that the difficult times weren't always specific hours, but more those empty blocks of time.
That used to be filled by using.
Exactly. It really drives home why structure and finding new, healthy ways to fill that time and find satisfaction is so critical in early recovery. You have to actively build new pathways.
Makes total sense. Let's maybe focus on a specific co-occurring condition for a moment. Bipolar disorder is mentioned quite a bit.
Yeah, the Case Western source highlights a really significant overlap there, especially with bipolar disorder. The co-occurrence rate was something like 65% back in 2021.
65%. That's incredibly high. Can you remind us, what are the main features of bipolar I?
Sure. Bipolar I is primarily characterized by these distinct mood episodes. You have manic episodes, periods of extreme highs, euphoria, tons of energy, sometimes impulsive behavior, even delusions.
Okay.
And then you have depressive episodes, the lows, profound sadness, loss of interest, fatigue.
And mixing that with a substance use disorder sounds incredibly challenging.
It really is. The source points out some negative links. People with both tend to have lower treatment retention, they drop out more easily. Functional recovery, getting back to daily life, is slower. They tend to use emergency services more often. There's increased impulsivity, and sometimes they don't respond as well to standard medications for either condition.
It just highlights that need for integrated care again, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Treating both at the same time.
Absolutely. Understanding that back and forth influence between the mood disorder and the substance use is key.
Okay, this feels like a good point to bring in those personal stories from the Reddit thread. Because behind all these stats and clinical terms are, well, real people fighting incredible battles.
Definitely. And those stories are so powerful. They really paint a picture of resilience amidst just huge challenges.
What kind of challenges were people talking about?
Oh, a whole range. Escaping abusive relationships, dealing with the fallout of childhood neglect, crushing financial problems, losing loved ones, battling severe mental health issues, sometimes undiagnosed for years, learning disabilities too.
Wow. And how did they manage to, as the prompt asked, kind of leave it behind and build a better life? What strategies came up?
It was really varied, which is interesting in itself, but some common themes definitely emerged. A big one was seeking professional help. Therapy, especially trauma-informed therapy, came up quite a bit.
This seems crucial for so many.
For sure. Also, prioritizing physical health, focusing on exercise, diet, getting involved in the community like volunteering or finding social groups, making big changes like going back to school or switching careers.
Setting goals, finding purpose.
Exactly. And
Right.
finding supportive relationships, friends, partners, family who actually helped.
I remember reading one story. Someone wasn't diagnosed with dyslexia until much later in life.
Yeah, that one stood out. And understanding that finally made such a difference to their self-worth and how they approached learning. It was like a light bulb moment.
It shows how understanding the root of a struggle can be transformative.
Totally. There was also a story about getting out of serious debt, just sheer hard work, saving consistently over years, though the person did mention getting a lucky break too, which felt very honest.
Right. It's often a mix of effort and circumstance.
And the connection theme was strong. Someone talked about breaking out of isolation by finding friends in unexpected places, like a hobby group.
Building that support network.
Yeah. And another person specifically mentioned how public assistance, like food stamps and grants, was vital for them to get through school while raising kids alone, eventually leading to a good career. Perseverance plus that safety net.
That's a powerful combination.
We also saw someone who battled depression and career stagnation, then went back to school, found a fulfilling new path, and got sober and found a loving partner, like a complete life turnaround.
It's really inspiring. It shows change is possible even when things seem bleak.
Absolutely. And stories of overcoming really difficult childhoods, lack of encouragement, just through pure grit, working hard, valuing education, building stability piece by piece.
What about escaping poverty?
There was one about working hard from a super young age, then military service, then education, demonstrating incredible resilience, especially after also dealing with loss and serious illness later on.
Just relentless forward movement.
Yeah. And another navigated a tough family dynamic and money struggles to eventually build a successful business. Financial independence was a big theme for some.
It's interesting the different definitions of leaving it all behind.
Oh, exactly. There was even a very short but impactful one about choosing recovery over staying in a destructive relationship, a clear turning point.
Sometimes it's one key decision.
Right. Or someone overcoming dropping out of school, depression, undiagnosed ADHD by going back to education much later and finding work they loved. And another, building a thriving career and family after experiencing homelessness and abuse earlier in life.
Just incredible strength.
Yeah.
But it's important to add, you mentioned the Reddit thread also had people saying it's not always about leaving it all behind, right?
Yes, that was a key counterpoint. Some people emphasize that recovery and managing challenges is often an ongoing process. You might be living a better life, but the difficulties don't just vanish forever. It's more about managing them.
That feels very realistic. It's not always a perfect Hollywood ending.
Not at all. It's often about finding sustainable ways to cope and thrive, even with ongoing struggles.
These stories really drive home the need for diverse kinds of support, which ties back nicely to the evidence-based treatments mentioned in the Case Western Source.
It does. They talk about a stage-wise approach, meeting people where they are in their readiness to change, and using techniques like motivational interviewing.
Which is about helping people find their own motivation,
Right.
not telling them what to do.
Exactly. It's collaborative. And then, of course, substance use counseling itself is key for developing healthier ways of thinking and behaving.
And they mention different formats, too.
Yeah, recognizing that one size doesn't fit all. So offering individual therapy, group sessions, family therapy, and leveraging peer support. Different things work for different people or at different times.
Makes sense. What about medication?
Pharmacotherapy is definitely part of the toolkit. The source mentions FDA-approved medications specifically for alcohol and opioid use disorders. These can help normalize brain chemistry, block those euphoric effects, or reduce cravings, making it easier to engage in therapy.
So it supports the behavioral changes.
Right. And then there are specific therapy types mentioned, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy.
Focusing on changing thought patterns and behaviors.
Yep. Also, specific groups for co-occurring disorders, motivational enhancement therapy, trauma-informed care, which is crucial given the links we discussed, and contingency management, which uses incentives.
Lots of tools. And peer support came up again.
Big time. Peer recovery support services where people with lived experience help others, and mutual support groups like Double Trouble Recovery or Dual Disorders Anonymous. They're specifically for people managing both mental health and substance use issues. That shared understanding can be incredibly powerful.
That peer connection seems vital. Building on that, the Case Western Source talked about a specific model, Integrated Dual Disorder Treatment, or IDDT.
Yes. This is really designed for people with severe mental illness and severe substance use disorders. The core idea of IDDT is treating both conditions at the same time by the same clinical team within the same agency.
So no more bouncing between a mental health clinic and an addiction center.
Ideally, no. It avoids that fragmentation of care. The focus is on integration and often on incremental progress, small steps, sustained effort over time.
And does it work? What are the outcomes?
They seem really positive, according to the source. IDDT is linked to better continuity of care, improved quality of life, more stable housing, greater independence,
That's huge.
and importantly, reductions in relapse rates, fewer hospitalizations, fewer arrests, less duplication of services, and lower overall costs to the system.
So it's better for the individual and more efficient. Win-win.
Pretty much. The model itself has key features. That multidisciplinary team, stage-wise interventions tailored to the person, comprehensive services that aren't necessarily time-limited.
So long-term support if needed.
Right. Assertive outreach to keep people engaged, motivational counseling, substance use counseling, psychoeducation for families too, medication management, promoting general health, and connecting people with self-help groups. It's very holistic.
A really comprehensive safety net.
Exactly. Designed for those with the most complex needs.
Okay, let's circle back to that Keene University study on daily habits in early recovery. What did they find people were actually doing all day?
Well, interestingly, rest and just basic daily living tasks like cooking, cleaning, personal care took up a pretty big chunk of time on both busy days and less busy days.
Just managing life's basics is a focus.
Seems like it, establishing that foundational stability. After that, work and recreation or social activities were the next most frequent things.
Okay. Were these all new activities people were starting?
That's one of the most interesting findings, actually. No. A significant portion of the activities people engaged in were not new.
Oh, like what?
The study suggests many people were returning to positive supports they might have had before or during active addiction, but perhaps neglected. Things like family connections, hobbies, religious or spiritual practices, work routines.
So recovery isn't always about inventing a whole new life, but maybe reclaiming positive parts of the old one.
That seems to be part of it, yeah. Re-engaging with those healthy anchors. It's quite an encouraging finding, I think.
It is. And it connects back to what we said earlier about difficult times often being linked to unstructured time and old using patterns.
Right. Not necessarily 5 p.m. every day, but rather those empty spaces where substance use used to fit. It highlights that need for structure and routine again.
So how do people build those new habits effectively? Did this study touch on that?
It mentioned that participants perceived a real need for consistency and structure. This lines up with what we know about habit formation, things like being aware of your patterns, having clear reasons why you want to change, making a concrete plan with specific goals.
And maybe linking the new habit to an old one. Like, after I brush my teeth, I'll meditate for 5 minutes.
Exactly, habit stacking. Pairing new, desired behaviors with existing routines makes them much more likely to stick. Building that supportive daily structure seems key for navigating early recovery.
Okay, finally, let's look at that Recovery Dharma study. It focused on mindfulness, meditation, and peer support. What was the main idea they were exploring?
They were looking at recovery capital. It's basically all the internal and external resources someone has that support their recovery journey. Think psychological strengths, social support, healthy environments.
Kind of like the building blocks for sustained recovery.
Precisely. And this study wanted to see what factors influenced the level of recovery capital among members of Recovery Dharma, which is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program.
And what did they find? What correlates with higher recovery capital?
They found positive links with several things: being older, having a sense of spirituality, feeling supported by the Recovery Dharma community specifically, being in recovery for longer.
Okay, those make sense.
And also meditation frequency and levels of mindfulness. But here's the really interesting part.
Go on.
When they crunched the numbers, the factors that significantly predicted a higher recovery capital, even after accounting for age and spirituality, were the perceived support from Recovery Dharma, how often someone meditated, and their level of mindfulness.
So those active engagement pieces were really driving it.
Exactly. It wasn't just about how long someone had been in recovery.
Oh, that is interesting. So just putting in time isn't enough on its own?
That's what this particular study suggests for this group. Simply accumulating years in recovery didn't automatically mean higher recovery capital. It was the active engagement, the meditation, the mindfulness practice, feeling connected to that supportive community that seemed to really build those resources.
It highlights that recovery is an active process, doesn't it? Not passive.
Absolutely. It's not just about not using, it's about actively cultivating these internal skills and external supports that foster well-being and resilience. These practices seem to directly contribute to that stronger foundation.
Wow. Okay, so bringing this all together.
Yeah.
It's been a real deep dive, hasn't it?
Definitely.
We've looked at the complexities of co-occurring disorders, the tangled web of risk factors, biological, environmental, substance-related. We explored how addiction physically changes the brain's reward system.
Yeah, and how challenging that makes things, especially when layered with conditions like bipolar disorder.
Then we heard those incredibly moving personal stories. So much adversity, but also so much resilience and so many different paths forward.
Reminding us of the human element behind the clinical picture.
Absolutely. We also touched on the evidence-based treatments, the real value of integrated care like IDDT, the surprising importance of routines and reclaiming old supports.
And finally, how actively engaging in things like mindfulness, meditation, and peer support can really build up that crucial recovery capital.
It's such an intricate picture. All these factors influencing substance use and mental health, and all these diverse yet somehow overlapping ways people find recovery. Thinking about everything we've discussed, what really stands out to you from all these insights and stories?
For me, it's maybe the reinforcement that connection and active engagement are so vital, whether it's connection to therapists, peers, healthy routines, or even just connection to oneself through mindfulness. It seems to be a thread running through everything. How about for you, thinking about our listeners?
I think it's the sheer complexity, but also the message of hope within that complexity. Seeing the science, the clinical approaches, and the lived experiences side by side. It shows that while the challenges are immense, recovery is absolutely possible, and there are many, many ways to get there. So maybe the final thought for you listening is, how might a deeper understanding of all these interconnected challenges change how we approach support and recovery, both for ourselves and in our communities?
That's a great question to ponder.
Yeah. And if any of this resonates with you or someone you know is struggling, please do explore resources like the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, or seek out professional help or peer support groups. There is help available.
There really is.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.